There are artists who change with time, and then there are artists who transform in ways that make the people closest to them stop and look twice. Keith Urban has always belonged to a rare category in country music, a man who seemed to carry both extraordinary talent and extraordinary pain in equal measure, navigating one with grace while quietly wrestling the other into submission. For years, that balance held. His smile was real, his music was honest, and his story of recovery felt like one of the most compelling second-act narratives the entertainment world had ever witnessed. But something has shifted. The man standing on stage in 2025 is not quite the same man who walked out of the Betty Ford Center in January 2007 with humility in his eyes and a second chance in his hands. The transformation is real, it is visible, and it is turning heads in ways that nobody, not fans, not colleagues, not industry insiders, fully anticipated. To understand what is happening now, you have to go back to the very beginning. Not to the awards or the albums or the headline-making marriage, but to a small boy in Brisbane, Australia, who fell in love with sound before he fully understood what love meant. Keith Lionel Urban was born on October 26, 1967, in Whangarei, New Zealand, and raised in Queensland, Australia, in a household where music was not background noise, it was the atmosphere itself. His father, Bob Urban, had a deep affection for country music, and that passion transferred to his son almost before Keith could walk steadily. By the age of 4, a ukulele had been placed in his small hands. By 5, a single Johnny Cash concert had ignited something in him that no amount of time or hardship would ever fully extinguish. Music was not something Keith chose. It was something that chose him, and it chose him early and with absolute certainty. The guitar came at 7, and with it came a seriousness that most children his age reserved for nothing at all. By 14, Keith was already performing in bars and talent competitions, absorbing the sounds around him, learning stages the way other teenagers learned classroom lessons. At 15, he made the decision to leave school entirely. It was a decision that raised eyebrows, and it carried risk, but for Keith Urban, there was simply no alternative worth considering. He had already identified his purpose, and anything that stood between him and that purpose felt like an obstacle rather than a foundation. That kind of singular focus is rare, and it produces brilliance. But it also produces blind spots. When everything you are is wrapped up in one dream, the things you haven't developed, the emotional tools, the coping mechanisms, the ordinary life skills that come from ordinary living, tend to remain underdeveloped, waiting quietly to cause problems later. The early public rejections stung in ways that a teenager's developing self-esteem is rarely equipped to handle cleanly. At 9 years old, Keith appeared on the Australian television talent show Pot of Gold, where Judge Barnard King offered criticism that dismissed the entire genre Keith had devoted himself to. The wound was softened slightly by a single word, intrinsically, which his mother helped him understand meant he possessed natural musical ability. But the sting of public dismissal had already embedded itself. Several years later, another televised attempt on New Faces ended without the victory he had hoped for. These were not catastrophic failures by any measure, but for a boy who had staked his entire identity on musical greatness, they landed with a weight that outlasted the moments themselves. The question of whether he was truly good enough would follow Keith Urban into adulthood, into addiction, and into the very heights of his success. Quietly, persistently, like a shadow that fades in bright light but never fully disappears. By 1991, Keith had released his self-titled debut album in Australia, and by 1992, he had made the decision that would either make him or break him entirely. He packed up his life and moved to Nashville, Tennessee, the heartbeat of country music, a city that had the power to transform raw talent into lasting legacy or grind it quietly into the pavement. Nashville did not welcome Keith Urban with open arms. The early years were brutal in the way that only genuine artistic struggle can be, not dramatic enough to be cinematic, just grinding enough to be demoralizing. He formed a band called The Ranch and spent nights performing in venues that barely qualified as stages, playing for audiences that barely qualified as crowds. The band released an album in 1997 that drew some attention but not enough momentum, and eventually the group dissolved, leaving Keith to navigate the next chapter alone. It was during those lean, lonely Nashville years that cocaine entered his life. It is important to name that plainly, without dramatizing it or minimizing it, because Keith Urban himself has never shied away from that truth. The addiction that would nearly destroy him did not arrive dramatically. It crept in the way addiction almost always does, as a solution before it became a problem, as relief before it became a trap. The pressures of trying to break into one of the world's most competitive music industries, combined with the deep-seated insecurities that had never been properly addressed, created exactly the kind of vulnerability that substances exploit. His first stint in rehabilitation came in 1998, and it interrupted the cycle. But interruption is not the same as resolution, and the roots of what drove Keith towards substance abuse remained largely untouched, waiting beneath the surface of his growing success like an old fault line. Because the success did come. Through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, Keith Urban's career began its remarkable ascent. His self-titled American debut in 1999 produced the hit, But for the Grace of God, and from there, the momentum built steadily and then explosively. Awards followed. Chart positions climbed. His guitar work drew the kind of reverence usually reserved for musicians decades older. He was nominated for and won Grammy Awards, CMA Awards, ACM Awards, the full spectrum of industry recognition that signals not just commercial appeal but genuine artistic respect. The world saw a charming, quietly spoken Australian with an easy smile and extraordinary hands, and the world fell in love with him. What the world could not see was the interior landscape of a man still carrying old wounds beneath a polished exterior, still asking himself in quiet moments whether he truly deserved any of it. The personal turning point that would redefine everything arrived in January 2005 at a charitable fundraising gala in Los Angeles. Keith Urban met Nicole Kidman, and by every account available, including his own, the connection was immediate and profound. Nicole was among the most recognized and respected actresses in the world, fresh from an extraordinary run of critically acclaimed work that had re-established her as one of her generation's finest performers. Keith was the rising force in country music, the guitarist with the golden touch and the backstory that made audiences lean in. Together, they seemed to operate on a frequency that neither had found elsewhere. Their relationship moved with a speed that surprised even those close to them, and in June 2006, they were married in a ceremony in Sydney that felt, to those watching from a distance, like the closing chapter of a difficult story and the beginning of a beautiful one. But addiction does not observe wedding vows. Approximately 4 months into the marriage, Keith relapsed. The substances that had first claimed him in Nashville returned, and with them came the emotional distance, the instability, and the private suffering that Nicole Kidman found herself watching with the particular anguish of someone who loves deeply and feels helpless. She did not wait for things to deteriorate beyond recovery. Instead, she gathered the people closest to Keith and organized an intervention, not with anger, not with ultimatums rooted in frustration, but with a clarity of love that Keith himself has described as the single most important moment of his adult life. He checked into the Betty Ford Center in October 2006. He remained there through the end of the year and emerged in January 2007 a different man. Not fixed, not finished, but genuinely committed to the work of becoming someone who no longer needed to hide from himself. The years that followed were the most disciplined and creatively expansive of his career. He approached sobriety not as a restriction but as a foundation, and from that foundation, his artistry deepened in ways that surprised even his most loyal supporters. The albums he released through the late 2000s and 2010s showed an artist unafraid to evolve, blending country with pop sensibilities, incorporating rock textures and electronic influences, stretching the genre's boundaries without abandoning its emotional core. Get Closer, released in 2010, carried a warmth and intimacy that felt lived in rather than performed.
Fuse in 2013 leaned into experimentation with a confidence that earlier Keith Urban albums had not possessed. Ripcord in 2016 and Graffiti U in 2018 demonstrated that he had no intention of standing still artistically, even as the personal stability he had built with Nicole and their 2 daughters gave him the kind of grounded security he had spent most of his life chasing. Television opened another dimension of his public persona during these years. His role as a coach on The Voice Australia beginning in 2011 revealed a mentorship style that resonated immediately with viewers and contestants alike. He was patient, perceptive, honest without cruelty, and possessed of the particular empathy that belongs to people who have been genuinely broken and genuinely rebuilt. When he joined the judging panel of American Idol in 2012, alongside the notoriously combustible combination of Nicki Minaj and Mariah Carey, Keith became something unexpected. The calm center of a chaotic storm, the judge contestants trusted most because his kindness felt earned rather than performed. He remained with the show through its original conclusion and returned as a mentor figure when it was revived years later. These television experiences did not manufacture a public persona for Keith Urban. They revealed one that had been developing quietly through years of genuine personal work. His Las Vegas residency, launched in later years, became a testament to the stamina and dedication that defined the post-recovery chapter of his life. Night after night, he brought a performance intensity that left audiences describing concerts in language usually reserved for religious experiences. His guitar playing, always exceptional, seemed to deepen with age, becoming more expressive and more emotionally precise as the years added their layers to his technique. The tattooed arms, the physical discipline, the sharpened features of a man in his mid-50s, all of it pointed towards someone who had chosen deliberately and repeatedly to invest in his own survival and vitality. He was not coasting on legacy. He was building it actively, day by day, note by note. And yet, something changed. The shift was not sudden, and it was not the kind of dramatic unraveling that generates immediate headlines. It was quieter and in some ways more unsettling for that quietness. People who had worked alongside Keith Urban for decades began noticing a tightening in his demeanor, a restlessness that had not been there before, decisions being made with a sharpness that sat at odds with the thoughtfulness he had always been known for. Early in 2025, reports emerged that Keith had abruptly dismissed multiple longtime members of his band, musicians who had stood beside him for more than 25 years, through the lean times and the triumphant ones, through the recovery and the residencies and the tours that crossed continents. The dismissals came without the warmth or transparency that had characterized his professional relationships for years.